Okay, let's start. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. And I'm delighted to welcome you to a special event we have this evening for Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. It is particular an intellectual pleasure and personal honor to have with us today Terry Kurgan and Marianne Hirsch, about whom I will speak in a second. Let me just say a few housekeeping things. Our event is being recorded, and all our events are posted on our YouTube channel. You can find more information on the Institute's website. If you want to join our mailing list, please do so. If you want to like us on Facebook, also. And I'd like to remind you that on April 20th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, we are going to have a conversation about Claudio Sont's book, Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. Sont will discuss it with Barbara Krauthammer, who is a historian as well as the Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass Amherst. Supposed to be very good. And this is part of our Encounters, which is a series of book talks that the Institute in Amherst is doing together with the Jerusalem Harman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. And now let me introduce our speakers. It is an honor and a pleasure to do so. Terry Kurgan is an artist and writer based in Johannesburg. Her artistic interest is in photography, and her focus across broad range of media is on the volatile and complex relationship between photography and fiction. Kurgan received her BA/FA from the California School of Arts in San Francisco, the MFA from the Michaelis School of Fine Arts, University of Cape Town, and her MA in creative writing from Wits University in Johannesburg. She joins us from Johannesburg. Well, it's a little bit later in the day there, so we appreciate it very, very much. She has exhibited and published widely in South Africa and internationally, and over the years received numerous prestigious fine arts awards. Today, we are going to discuss her book, Everyone is Present, Essays on Photography, Memory, and Family, which won the 2019 Ellen Patton Prize in South Africa, was selected as finalist for the 2019 National Jewish Book Award in New York, and shortlisted for the 2019 Photo Oral Book Prize in France. It is a riveting, emotional story of her family during the Holocaust, interweaving diary, photographs, and text. Discussing it with her will be Marianne Hirsch, who is the William Petterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a former president of the Modern Language Association of America. She was born in Romania and educated at Brown University, where she received her BA, MA, and PhD degrees. Her work combines feminist theory with memory studies, particularly the transmission of recollections of violence across generation. Anyone who has anything to do with memory studies knows her path-breaking book, The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust. Terry and Marianne are going to discuss for about 45-50 minutes. Then we are going to open up the floor for questions. please put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat, but in the tab, and I will then join the conversation and moderate the discussion. Terry and Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you to the Institute for inviting us. Hello, Terry. Wonderful to be here with you. It's an honor and a pleasure. So I was just going to start off with some questions to Terry, besides expressing my pleasure at being here, on what we are celebrating or observing as Holocaust Remembrance Day in the US, following Israel's choice of this day, which is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that was chosen as a day to observe the memory of the Holocaust. In many parts of Europe, it's observed on January 27th, which is the day of the liberation of Auschwitz. These days of memory are important, but I feel I'm so glad to be here reflecting in a very different way on memory, not just through observing, but through reflecting on the complexities of memory and the multiplicity of archives and the difficult and dedicated work of memory that you, Terry, have undertaken in this incredibly wonderful book, Everyone is Present. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, to tell us about the project, to tell us how you came to it, to tell us about the amazing journey of your family during the Second World War, but also your own engagement with that history.
Thank you, Marianne. And just quickly, thank you, Alon, for this generous invitation. I'm honored to be in conversation with Marianne Hirsch, who's been thinking about the cultural, emotional, and political currency of family and vernacular photography, and about photography and visual culture after the Holocaust for so many years now. And it's important to add her many books, some of which have been co-authored with her partner, Leo Spitzer, have been a complete lighthouse for me in my grappling to understand and bring to the surface certain preoccupations that have been with me for as long as I remember. So thank you. My book, Everyone is Present, grows directly out of almost 30 years of a multimedia professional visual arts practice that is largely about familial intimacy and the legacies of migration, displacement, and socio-political fracture, and this most often in my own South African context. I usually explore these themes through the prism of photography and photographic meaning. And so my practice and this book is also always about photography. It's important to emphasize that word about. I'm really not a photographer. In fact, I'm quite technophobic with regard to cameras, but even when I have taken photographs and exhibited them in museums and galleries, or when a project involves public participation and has the making of photographs at its heart, those photographs are always about themselves as physical objects and about what photographs mean in the world, how they act in the world. And then of greatest interest to me is how they're able to hide both time and secrets. So where did the idea for this book come from? I'm going to share my screen for a moment to show you the physical objects that were the roots and the basis for embarking on the journey of this project. Just a moment. There we go. Okay. So my mother and her parents came to South Africa during the war years from Poland. My mother was born in Lwów in the east of Poland, but in fact, her parents were living at the time that the war began in Bielsko in the southwest of Poland. It's a small, it's now called Bielsko-Biale, and it's a small town right near Krakow, which is probably more familiar to most people. And my book begins with, let me just go to the next slide. Oops. There we go. My book, can you see that image, Marianne?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
My book begins and ends in relation to this image, which is shot in Zakopane, which is in the southwest of Poland. It's in the Tatra Mountains in the Alps. And Zakopane, during the interwar years, was an extraordinarily fashionable and bohemian holiday resort. It attracted artists and writers and people who were experimenting with painting, writing, drugs, sex, all sorts of things. It was a very unusual and exciting town, particularly during the interwar years. And this is where my Polish family, who lived in Bielsko, went on summer holidays. The women and the children would pack up, and the men would commute on the weekends from work. And this photograph sort of has hung over me and been with me for years. In fact, for many, many years, I thought that the man on that deck chair was my grandfather. The photograph is the image with which I open the book, and it's an essay. It's an essay that sort of locates. It's an essay called Family Affairs that locates my story and introduces the complexity of the relationships between the various members of my family. Now, that's my grandmother, that's my 4-year-old little mother, and that's my grandmother's lover into whose ear my mother is whispering a secret. I won't say much more about that now, but the book, let me go to the next slide. Okay, so my grandfather kept the most extraordinarily detailed daily diaries. Each one of those, so this handful of photographs and these years and years diaries that begin on the first day of the Second World War in 1939 and that end just before his death in Cape Town in 1973 are the basis, the raw material upon which I based this project. Each one of those little sections that you see being held together with a paper clip represents 1 month. And my grandfather must have been keeping these diaries, you know, most of his life, but we only have them from the day that they fled Bielsko. So here's another photograph closer up to give you a sense of what beautiful objects they were. They were handmade. He cut the pieces of paper all exactly the same size. He used this gorgeous fountain pen. And this small handful of family photographs that were shot between 1935 and 1943 are what I've based my project on. And so the project tells, on one level, the project has a Holocaust narrative, but Holocaust with a small h. I'm going to go back to my grandfather's journals. On the one hand, my project has a Holocaust narrative. It tells the story of the family's lives that were disrupted, how they fled. They were always just one day ahead of not being able to get away with their lives. My grandmother was extraordinarily prescient, and she forced my grandfather to leave Bielsko by sending the children ahead and over the Romanian border with her brother and sister-in-law. And my grandfather, who didn't want to leave, followed. The family spent a year living in Romania. They spent hours, their quest in the year that they lived in Romania was to try and procure visas. And, you know, as all of you know, there were very few countries that were considering taking in Jews, and they queued. You know, my grandfather's diaries are full of the unbelievable difficulties of everyday life and the struggle to both, you know, feed the family and find a way out of Europe. And so the book tells, on the one hand, the story of their journey, which is from Poland to Romania to Istanbul. They go to Syria. They go via, they leave, you know, via the Black Sea. They travel the Persian Gulf. They go in the completely opposite direction that refugees have been moving these last few years, and towards the fortress of Europe. They spend a length of time living in Bombay. They finally manage to procure visas for Brazil. And the only way that they can travel there is from Bombay via Cape Town to Rio de Janeiro. This was during, you know, they were traveling during the time where South Africa was also not allowing, you know, between 1937 and 1948, Jews were not allowed into South Africa. They were not, you know, white enough for the Union of South Africa and things as they were being run at that time. And my family accidentally landed up in South Africa because my grandmother's brother got smallpox on the ship between Bombay and Mombasa. The whole family were herded into a hospital for infectious diseases, and this is where their luck and their visas ran out. And after a month in Mombasa, they were brought to Cape Town by the Jewish Board of Deputies. So that's a skeleton of the facts. But the book is about photography, it's about memory, it's about complicated familial relationships, and it is also about time and about family secrets. Marianne, back to you.
So you said you might read us a little piece to give us a sense of the texture of the project, and then we can talk a little bit more about your process and the archives that you consulted and the research you've done and some of the issues the book raises.
Just before I read the passage that I've chosen, I want to say something else, that, you know, there's an often repeated quotation from the work of the psychoanalyst Nicholas Abram. He said, "What haunts are not the dead, but the gaps left within us by the secrets of others." This is from his book on the Phantom, Notes on the Phantom, which was actually written with his partner, Maria Turok. And I understand this to mean what I've inherited in my DNA. So this book is my, you know, what I myself have inherited in my DNA at a cellular level, what has been delivered into my unconscious by the experience of the generations that have come just before me and just before them, what has been bred in the bone. I haven't personally suffered the loss that my grandparents and my mother did, or suffered what they experienced during those years of the Holocaust, but they lived with buried and repressed memories of unspeakable acts and loss, which I believe were delivered into my unconscious and have been there for as long as I can remember. And so this book is my attempt to unravel family history, myths, and secrets in order to make conscious for myself what I've come to understand as intergenerational transmission. I should have said that right at the beginning, but it's an important frame around.
Well, and I should say that so many of us have done that, but I think your particular process and your particular interest in photography and your particular work as a writer have given this a very distinctive have created a really distinctive book that's unlike any others. And that's not because the story is so distinctive, but it's because of how you've approached the story.
Thank you, Marianne. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that you can. So when I wrote this book, I was trying to make a book at the sort of intersection between, images and writing, visual art and literature. I tried, and you won't understand it until you actually hold the object in your hands, but I tried to work with images and text in an equivalent way. And I deal with these photographs forensically. I zoom in and I show you those zooms. I describe them in words and I show them in images. I'm going to share the screen so that you can see the photographs that I'm talking about as I read. It's an excerpt from the fourth essay in the book called Street View. And just to give you, so that you know where I'm starting, it's the 1st of September. War has just been declared. My grandfather was not at home, so my grandmother and her 2 small children fled east, which everybody did. And they left him a note to follow. and he's back home alone in the apartment thinking about that. Okay. The radio warns people to move into shelters in the event of further attacks from the air. He retrieves his camera from the top drawer of his writing desk, noticing that the 3 drawers underneath it are partly open, and that the chronologically ordered pile of notebooks he filled this year has been overturned. He stacks and reorders the notebooks, and then moves across to the open bay window and pushes the intricately woven damask curtains aside. The pavements and the broad streets below are deserted. It's turning to autumn and there's just the hint of a chill in the air. The 2 well-tended beds of shrubs and flowers outside the bunk polski, dark green, reds and violets, some salmon pink and cornflower blue, are all in their last bloom. The doors to the bank have been shuttered and locked. He observes how well polished the double set of brass BP insignia on the middle doors appear in this light. They've forgotten to take in the doormat. In April 1938, the Polish state's largest financial institution adopted a provision to exclude Jews. It has been over a year since he last dusted off his shoes and crossed that white marble threshold. A small dachshund appears. It lifts its back leg and relieves itself against the bottom of the gas streetlight pole before vanishing tail up at a trot into the park at the end of the block. The sirens have quieted now, and the broad street below is almost deserted. He knows he should hurry, but it is such a rare pleasure to inhabit the quiet of his home all alone. 2 men walk into his field of vision. They're engrossed in conversation and seem strangely relaxed under the circumstances. They stop to light their cigarettes, and one of them begins to raise his arms. And it is at this moment that my grandfather lifts the camera, chooses his aperture, finds his focus, and composes the shot. The sirens sound again. The men pick up their pace, turn left at the corner, and disappear. I packed a small suitcase with 2 changes of clothing, our certificates and documents, some photographs, my stamp collections, recipes and experiments, the camera, and then on second thoughts, my revolver. I left a note for Truda with our address and telephone number in Lvov, asking her to clear the table and telling her that on her way out, she should leave her keys and an envelope I'd prepared with our neighbor, Mrs. Kara. I noticed that my hand was shaking. I watered the plants. I closed the windows. I drew the curtains. I wound up the clock. Then I stood for a while before I locked the door. The photograph in the album is just 5 by 8 centimeters, and the inscription on the page in white in that spidery hand reads Ulica Sixta. It is late afternoon. We see the clean, wide and empty pavements, the flower beds in the park just beyond them, a domestic garden behind a wrought iron fence, and the solid, functional, heavy sandstone masonry monumentally grounding the bottom of each building. A narrow path of bright sunlight running between them interrupts the very deep shadows that they cast. My grandfather was photographing the street, but what rivets my attention are the two men dwarfed by the massive architecture that dominates the frame, and by the distance from which he took the shot, the indistinct expressions on their blurred out faces, and then most particularly, the ambiguous gesture of the man on the right. I scan the little photograph at a high resolution and zoom in on the detail I'm straining to see. They're both holding cigarettes. The man on the left is just about to bring his up towards his mouth for another good draw. And while the man on the right is holding his in his left hand with his arms raised in surrender. Both men appear to be looking directly up and at my grandfather, but I wonder whether at this moment of capture he's also looking at them. He was famously extremely short-sighted, and everything at a distance would have appeared to him in a blur. Perhaps the man is trying to attract his attention, or marking his presence in front of the lens, or perhaps he is waving, or taunting, or warning. As I enlarge the photograph to the point just before it dissolves into a two-dimensional grid of pixels, my inability to uncover the meaning of that gesture is perhaps part of the meaning of that time. It is very clear that the man with his arms up in the air is looking directly up at the man in an open bay window, and I want to be able to see what he sees. My grandmother's Polish identity book, issued in 1936, records her home address as number 10 ulica Teodora Sixta, Bielsko. I type this into Google Street View, and within a matter of seconds, I'm in color, in bright summer weather, and, as I'm soon to discover, dead in front of their original front door. Google must have been here at more or less the same time of day, and judging by the trees which are in leaf in a similar season. The afternoon sun still envelops that bank building, and while the road is paved with different materials, the gas street lamp is gone, and the bank's name and external light fittings have changed. The late summer flower beds my grandfather was admiring just outside the right-hand edge of this frame are still there, and the doors up those stairs to the building are still shuttered. I move the image in a circular motion towards the left and bring it closer towards me. A strange, distorted sense of depth comes from the panoramic stitched together view. I notice pots of deep red geraniums peeping over the lyrically ornamental top right-hand balustrade. Peering up at the apartments, I long to know which one it was. I try to zoom in more closely and find a position parallel to the front door. I want to see the doorbells and name plaques and perhaps the exact brass door handle they would so frequently have touched. But no matter how carefully I deploy the technology, this is as close as I can get. That pole is always in the way of a more direct line of sight. Janina Molson, artistic dressmaker, creator of wedding gowns and business suits, reads the sign. I zoom into the window on the left, but the faint promise of a glimpse of Janina at her sewing machine, or methodically pinning up the hemline of a wedding dress behind those pink and yellow fabric flowers, disintegrates into vivid color-filled squares, and once again my view is frustrated. I scour the facade of the building for clues. This is a close-up cropped view of one of 4 curved bay windows and set into the building in which my family once lived. It has slipped through the dispassionate impersonality of Google's net. On this warm summer's day, the window is wide open, and a sun-drenched white muslin curtain has billowed outside of it and is moving with the breeze. The image speaks about the interior and beckons me inside. I can easily imagine somebody just beyond this curtain. Perhaps they're eating breakfast in a sunbeam at a table in the room, but my high-resolution screen won't let me in. The curtain very quickly dissolves behind the spikes that have been placed on the windowsill to keep birds from perching or nesting there. it's hard not to take those sharp spikes quite personally.
Mm-hmm.
That's as far as I'll go with that. But it's to give you a sense of how I work with photography.
I'm
yeah,
so struck by, well, first of all, the materials you have are overwhelming because you have these incredible photos, but then you have these diaries that tell so much of the story, but also, as you said, leave gaps. And I'm really interested in how differently you seem to be working with these different materials. And I would love to hear you talk more about that. So on the one hand, you have the photographs and you say, I want to be in the picture. I want to see what he sees. And we see you zooming in and actually trying to enter the photo, to be in the place. You said, I long to be able to sit inside this photograph. And you even show us the bench on which you'd like to sit, which is an empty bench behind your mother and grandmother. So that's one thing. But then the diaries enter your text. So, you know, you're entering the photographs, but the diaries seem to enter your text. And you even talk about how the story becomes more and more gripping, that your grandfather tells of the journey, and they threaten to upstage your story. And there's even one of the essays where you quote more and more of the diaries because you can't keep from giving us more and more of that story. And also it seems that the diaries then begin to shape your narrative, because when it becomes a travelogue, your narrative, you know, threatens to become a travelogue. So I just wanted to hear you talk more about how you work with these different materials to create what you've created, which is this blended object.
Okay. So, you know, with regard to the photographs, and I mean, this is how I relate to photographs generally. You know, photographs are, for me, never more than evidence. You know, evidence like the evidence that is left to be interpreted and examined at the scene of a crime. And you know, with these photographs particularly, I longed to be able to see beyond the edges of the frame and to sort of get through the opaque two-dimensional surface of each one of them. But all that I can ever really do is imagine. I can look at each, you know, part of the image as carefully as possible, interpret. I can never really know what my grandfather, you know, was looking at. I mean, I've always been, and I was particularly in these photographs, compelled by and fascinated by and curious about what my grandfather might have wanted in making these images. They were so often photographs of his beautiful wife not making eye contact with him. She looks away, she's looking at somebody else in the photograph. Sometimes he photographs her in relation to another family member or a lover. And you know, the photographic interaction, the inequality of that interaction was always of great interest to me. And so the difference, I suppose, between working with the diaries and working with the photographs, the diaries, I had a much stronger sense of what it was that he intended me, although he probably never intended me to read them, but what he intended in what he put down on the page. They are extraordinary documents in that they record some aspects of his internal life and much of the detail of this extraordinary, difficult journey. And but they are also, you know, incredible records of what he was reading, what he was cooking, they were very, very short of money. I mean, they were upper middle class, university educated Jews. He, for example, was educated at universities in Vienna, Berlin. They didn't speak Yiddish. They disparaged the Yiddish speakers. They disparaged the Lithuanians, particularly when my mother went and married one of them. But his diaries, you know, offered me so many different projects. But I felt about the writing that they were more reliable somehow than the photographs, which I interpreted in terms of what I too needed to resolve by, you know, trying to understand and use them to tell much bigger stories that went beyond their friends.
You've talked about being haunted, and then you brought the Nicholas Abraham notion of the phantom and the gaps. And I mean, this is such a fascinating record, not only of one family's journey, very well documented actually journey, and also the stresses that face a family, both in normal, you know, ordinary life. I mean, there are affairs, there's, you know, betrayal, there's jealousy. I mean, there are all of these complicated relationships, but so magnified by refugeehood and by war and by persecution and illness and visas and all of these other things. So there's just so much of that. So I'm wondering how you went about relating family history to this larger, broader map of world history that were colliding, and in which the dramas could be of equal magnitude. You know, your mother's you know, affair could, you know, have the same kind of huge impact on the other relationship as the war. You know, so how did you manage to find an equilibrium or you know, in some ways bring these stories together and allow them to kind of sit together in this volume?
You know, I was very self-conscious or conscious of how much more powerful it is to tell a story of this magnitude, you know, Holocaust, genocide, refugees, by focusing on the intimate and personal family story of just a small group of people. It somehow tells the story way more powerfully than you know, than telling a quite impersonal history. And you know, this, you know, the Holocaust, you know, hangs like a cloud of smoke over the book, but I very carefully and deliberately tried not to tell it in a very formal and big. It's too big and too terrible to be able to comprehend. And somehow, by focusing on the internal lives of my grandfather, the relationship between the two of them set against this incredibly difficult journey, it somehow for me told this whole story of dispossession, of past lives, of lost lives, of living the wrong life, of landing up in a place that really didn't want you to begin with. You know, focusing on intimate, personal, small detail for me told the story more powerfully than the big history. But I kept going to the big history. I found the research process of this project so fascinating. Can
you tell us a little bit more about like moments in your research where things kind of came together and where you have these epiphanic moments in the book that are so moving?
Well, there's so many. I mean, just to begin with, that photograph that I showed everybody, let me share the screen again. The photograph that I showed everybody, where's my share screen? whoops. View. This photograph. My mother's second cousin, Arthur Rose, is still alive and well and living right under the Brooklyn Bridge. His story is not for this context, but he told me that they were on holiday at this photograph was taken the summer of 1939, just before the war. So it's the last holiday they ever took in this beautiful place. And he remembered the name of the hotel, and I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but it's called the Yashni Palace. And he described it, and I went online, and there it was. So that was completely extraordinary. That the hotel had retained its external facade and some of the grandeur in the inside, but I went on a visit. I went back to Poland, both with my husband. I went back a second time with my mother, and we stayed in the hotel. And so that was one of the most extraordinary coincidences. There was so much that we discovered on these 2 trips that we made to Zakopane. But another bit of extraordinary research, I tried very hard to be able, in order to write this book and to try and imagine a much fuller sense of their lives than was captured in this handful of photographs. I tried to find accounts of what life might have been like for the Jewish community in this town of Bielsko, and I read the extraordinary memoir of Gerda Weissman Klein, whose story of survival is also quite extraordinary. Some of you may have read the book. Let me get to this image. Gerda Weissman Klein mentions my grandfather in his diaries just before leaving. Mentions he was a gardener, and even though they lived in a block of flats, he worked in the garden that was right behind. There was a sort of communal garden that everybody could access. And he made the observation that the roses were blooming particularly early this year. Gerda Weissman Klein, who lived down the road, and her mother, her brother, and her father did not survive, but she survived the camps, death marches, was liberated by an American Jewish soldier whom she eventually married. And she wrote this extraordinary memoir in the 50s about all of this. And she describes in wonderful detail what her father had just had a heart attack, so they couldn't leave Bielsko, as my family did, and as so many Jews did. They couldn't flee. Her father was recovering at home, and she watched from her 3rd floor, the 3rd story building. She watched the Germans coming into Bielsko, and that was what I needed. I needed to be able to describe what had happened on that day. And she mentions that her mother had been particularly proud of her roses that had bloomed early this year, and she noticed her neighbor cutting her mother's roses and handing them to a Nazi at the beginning, a Nazi and his troops, and how angry she was and how angry her mother was about what had become of their roses. Now, part of my research, I was online looking again for videos and anything that would give me a sense of what Bielsko had been like in 1939. And I came upon this peculiar short video made by somebody in 2014. Here you go. If you Google it yourselves, you can see it says Bielsko Biala 3914. Some person had made one of those weird YouTube videos set to music where he had juxtaposed photographs of spaces and places in Bielsko in 1939 with those same spaces and places in 2014. And lo and behold, there is a photograph, and there is the soldier holding the roses. I mean, it was one of those completely extraordinary coincidences.
It's such a moving moment in the book where you really feel that everything is coming together about your research and the process. And I feel like that's what we all aim for as we're in the second generation people, as you said, who have not lived through this, but who've grown up with these stories. What we want to do is enter the picture and imagine what the day was like. And by putting these different, different moments together and this one little bunch of roses, you really feel that, and you can smell those flowers. You can imagine that day in a way that is so difficult to accomplish. So I guess maybe as my last question, I know we want to open up to other questions. What about your visits to the place? Do you feel like you opened up more by being there, that you learned more from being there? Were you able to bridge that gap between the present and the past? I mean, so much of this book is about the present. It's about your work as an artist and as a writer, trying to reconstruct something, but also to work through, as you said, to work through this haunting.
Yeah. So, so much of this book is about trying to go back, to recover something that was never mine to begin with. And Marianne, this is where, you come into the picture as well with I think the first time you wrote about your post-memory theories, which I think, if people in the audience haven't read your books, it would be useful to mention here. I think in your 1997 book, Family Frames, is where I first understood and read about your theories of post-memory. And I understood that to mean, and it really resonated, it was a term that you coined to capture memory as it manifests itself in the transgenerational reverberation of an event. I mean, in material terms, I think you mean that post-memory is embodied as the after image that certain photographs provoke. Photographs that hover between an individual's memory and impersonal history. It's possible that even though I didn't live through those kinds of events myself, these images pervade, the culture I inhabit. They pervade my unconscious, and so on. These photographs of my grandfathers, which are just a little bit of evidence of a past life that was destroyed under the most terrible of circumstances, have always hung above me and felt as though they were my own experience in so many ways. And oddly, I went back. It was an extraordinary trip. I went back to Bielsko with my mother, and it was something we decided to do for her 80th birthday. And she hadn't, because Bielsko was one of the first towns that the Germans invaded, and also because it was half the population were German, and it had been called Bierlitz, at the end of before the end of the First World War, it was German. They walked in and people were really pleased to see them, as you just saw in that photograph that I showed. People are cheering and waving and happy to see the German army. And the town was perfectly intact. And the building that my mother had last lived in 1939 and left when she was 4 years old, which looked as if it hadn't been swept since 1939, was perfectly intact. And it was a very, very moving visit. It was extraordinary to me how happy it made her to be there, given everything that happened. She was extraordinarily happy to be there. We walked all the walks. She had been in the care as upper middle class children were, and also because she had such a sort of narcissistic and uninvolved mother, she had been in the exclusive care of a nanny, of a Polish nanny who had taken her regularly to church. And she remembered that walk, and we walked that walk together. We went to the church together. We retraced her footsteps as much as we were able. And it was an extraordinary experience to be doing that with her, but it was also very, very useful, the whole visit, in terms of the development of the plot of my book. This attempt of mine at retrieval. I try and retrieve something, as I say, that was never mine to begin with, through these 75-year-old faded photographs. I try and go there through Google. I try and go there, I try and go there physically myself. And, each of these essays circulates around photographs and are pretty much about my attempt to recover something, I remember, Marianne, you asked me to read the very last paragraph of my book. Would this be a good moment to do that?
Yes, I was just going to ask you that.
So I'm still here with David. Now this is another trip to Zakopane. I'm still here with David in Zakopane. We have packed the car and are almost ready to go. As I carefully sweep the elegant reception rooms of the hotel with my camera one more time, frame by frame, just before we're about to leave for the long drive back to Berlin, still looking for a molecule of air they might have breathed, a flake of skin, an eyelash, I suddenly notice my own reflection in the mirror looking through my camera lens, and it drives home the point of the complete impossibility of a very particular kind of retrieval.
Yeah, well, I think that says it best. So maybe we should stop here and open this up to questions.
Thank you, Terry and Marianne. It's a fascinating conversation. I call the audience to put your questions. And Terry, let me ask you something about the role of secrets in this story, and also what it meant for you. You know, when did you start getting to know that there are secrets in the family? When did you start thinking that you want to write about them? How did you feel about it? Did you feel that there are secrets that should remain secret because they are not yours? Or there are secrets in the first photo?
Yeah.
From your mother. I mean, of course, she's 4 years old, but when did she get to know that her mother, the person in the photograph, were actually lovers? So if you can tell us a little bit about the secrets, the photographs and the diary and you, and how you interwove this thing.
Okay. Well, I should mention, and I should also thank my mother, Leonia Kurgan, who wrote a memoir of her own. But, you know, she excited my interest in this material. She saw fit to preserve these diaries and these photographs. And all my childhood and growing up, I was aware, nobody spoke about them. That's typical. But after my grandmother died, so my grandfather died about 8 years before my grandmother. My mother moved. She had gone to live in the US. She was living in Los Angeles, and she took all this material to Los Angeles with her. And it was in those years that I became aware of secrets. I became aware that photograph that I showed was not, in fact, my grandfather. And my mother began to tell me the story of my grandmother's many lovers. And this she was telling me in the context of her own sense of having been enormously neglected as a child. You know, I think her mother, as I mentioned earlier, was a tremendously narcissistic person who didn't know how to mother her daughters. Her own mother had similarly been a tremendously narcissistic person, and she features in a big way in my book. She's a formidable woman, my great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother. Because my mother had written, you asked about the secrets, because my mother had already outed the story in her own memoir and told me so much about it, I felt comfortable. I felt comfortable trying to uncover more of the story. the diaries were translated after my grandfather died. My grandmother translated the first 1939 and 1940, the first 2 years of the diaries, and we discovered she had translated them entirely in her own interest. She'd edited out anything unfavorable, about anything unflattering, and there was plenty, you know, that he had written about her, anything about the family arguments. I mean, it was such a tense and difficult time. There were 10 of them. 10 of them walked from Poland to Romania. 10 of them, you know, traveled, you know, by land, by train, by sea across the world until they eventually came to South Africa, and with no money. I mean, they kept, you know, begging various organizations for assistance and pawning jewelry. Their jewelry really saved their lives in a big way. But there were also the secrets of my grandfather's diaries. You know, my grandfather, the diaries my mother then took the same, I'll go back to my mother took the same 2 years of diaries to a translator. And that's how we discovered my grandmother had you know, translated them so much in her own favor. But beyond those 2 years, there were another 30 years that had never been translated, which you know, my mother generously allowed me to bring all this material to South Africa about 7 years ago. And I got a grant, and it unlocked her childhood for her, having these diaries translated. But my grandfather, it was an intensely neurotic and private space, and very much, you know, amongst there was a text and there was a subtext, and the subtext was that he was really living the wrong life, and he was living the wrong life for so many reasons. You know, he came from Brode, which you may know, Alon and Marianne, was the center of the Jewish Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. It was both very religious and also very secular. And his family, his father and his father's brothers were community leaders. They were both leaders in a religious sense, and they were also business leaders. And he was educated along with Joseph Roth, the writer Joseph Roth. He went to the same junior school, the same high school. And he was a very educated intellectual, a dreamer. He wanted to be a psychoanalyst, but Jews weren't allowed into medical school. So, you know, in that sense, he was living the wrong life. He had a domineering father who forced him into the family's pharmaceutical business. So that his diary is full of quite anxious and unhappy secrets, both in terms of his thwarted desires and ambitions, and his unrequited love for my grandmother.
It seems to me, Terry, that your mother's editing of the diary is as interesting as the diary. And actually, it's a wonderful material for a story, because it gives another perspective about. Let me.
And can I just say that one of the things we learned from this book is how many different perspectives there are, and photographs are perfect that way because it's taken from one angle, right? But you reframe them over and over again, so you bring in other angles. And the book is so much about transmission, but also at what happens every time we have a new perspective, and the translations are one of those different perspectives.
Exactly. I mean, at the front, you know, for me, this is all about how unfixed the meaning of photographs is. You can never, you know, so, you know, the meaning of a photograph is impossible to fix. There's a subject, there's the photographer, there's the viewer, and we all bring different interpretations to it, and we all bring different desires to it. Then also there's narrative, memory. None of these things can be fixed, and that's very much the subject of the book as well. You know, the book is about photography, memory, and narrative.
Terry, let me take a comment and then two questions. We have many more questions. What seems unusual and different in your approach is the importance and weight you give the present in your relationship with the past. As an artist working now, this makes completely sense. So this is a comment, but I want to bring also two questions. One is, how did you begin this project? What finally brought you to actually begin the work on those photos, and in which stage of your life? And another question is about whether you and your mother were aware of what happened to the children taken to Zakopane after the war to recuperate, the threats from the Poles that forced the children to evacuate in fear of their lives, and if and how that history affected the familiar story you were telling.
Okay, well, look, they holidayed in Zakopane. They didn't come from Zakopane, and we were aware of that story. I'm answering the last part first. We were aware of that story because Arthur Rose, my mother's cousin, who was hidden by he came from also a secular educated family in Krakow. His father was one of 10 siblings. Nobody from his father's generation survived, and they were, Arthur and his little sister Anna were hidden in an apartment by a Christian family who were clients of his lawyer father in Lvov. They were hidden right next door, the German Officers Club. And Arthur's parents were hiding elsewhere and were betrayed by the person who was hiring them and shot by the Gestapo. And at the end of the war, it's one of those, sort of how anecdotes sometimes are they sort of versions of stories change so that they become the truth because of well, the story about Arthur was that he had walked his little sister. He was 10 years old. He'd walked his little sister across Europe at the end of the war. What he'd actually done is taken his little sister all the way back to Krakow, from where they were sent to this very camp in Zakopane, and they were attacked. And family, and that's another story. But so yes, I do know about Zakopane, and it did impact my mother's cousins. But about the past and the present, this book, which I feel as a work in my body of work as an artist and a writer now, is darker and more complex, as well as wider in scope than anything I've ever made before it. It proposes what I've always believed, and that is that the past is deeply implicated in the present, and that the more carefully we look at the world, the more we find evidence of the vanished past, that the present is made from remains of the past, but also reciprocally, that the past is shaped by the present when we try to find it, So I call the book Everyone is Present, and I'm making reference to everybody who's come before me. And the epigraphs in the beginning of my book, one is an epigraph from Jenny Erpenbeck's The End of Days. And it might be useful to read it here in relation to that question about past and present. So this is Jenny Erpenbeck. He carries around within him a vast dark land, all the stories his mother never told him or that she hid from him. Perhaps he carries with him even those stories his mother never knew or heard of. He can't get rid of them, but he can't lose them either, since he doesn't even know them, since all of this lies buried deep within him. For when he slipped from his mother's womb, he was already filled with interior spaces that didn't belong to him. I suppose I'm repeating what I was saying earlier in answer to one of Marianne's questions, but yeah, I think the past powerfully impacts upon our present and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answered everything there, Alon.
We cannot answer everything. We have multiple unfixed perspectives, isn't it? Let me present a few more questions, and you can decide what you want, because there are really many questions. What did researching and writing the book has done to your cultural identity? And there is a question about audience from someone audience. Yeah. From someone who is writing a family history, a Holocaust family history, and struggles with the audience question, something sometimes she wants my children to know. Sometimes there is the wish that a broader interest would be presented. So when you wrote it, when did the personal and the historical, when did the personal and the more broader historical audience came into focus for you? Was there any contradiction, or did you have an ideal reader in mind? And finally, someone asks, you indicate how unfixed photos are, but aren't diaries also unfixed? I also thought about this when you talked about diaries. So do you trust the written word more than the visual? I also had the same thought when you talked about the secrets in the photos and the diary that illuminate them. And perhaps the diary, as your grandmother knows, diaries also can be edited as much as photos. So.
No, no, absolutely. Those are too many questions for me to remember. I should have written them down, but I'll start at the end. It's always easier to do it that way. You're absolutely right. I mean, I found in at the very beginning of this project, I gave a talk in Johannesburg and showed some of the slides of the diaries, and a young man approached me and he said, you know, I could read those. I'm Polish. And he told me the extraordinary story of his family, of his father, who was born 6 months after my mother, right near Lvov, not in Lvov, but in a smaller town near Lvov. And, you know, the Germans hated the Jews and the Russians hated the Poles. And his father lived in a town of 150,000 people, and all of them were sent, you know, to the Gulag, where his mother died. And this is the man who translated my grandfather's diaries. His own mother died because of the harshness of camp life and so on. But this man, you know, through a whole lot of circumstances that are not relevant now, landed up as a physician at a public hospital in Johannesburg, and he retired. He was 80. And he slowly began to translate these diaries, and he was an intensely political person. You know, he had been thrown out of Poland during in the 80s. He was thrown into jail and given the option to stay in jail or leave the country. And he was very irritated. He loved my grandfather's diaries, and he was as intellectual as my grandfather. So he had a lot to add. He understood a lot of his references, and he understood the handwriting, which is the handwriting of a former period. But he would get very annoyed, you know, by my grandfather's, particularly in the South African years, his lack of engagement with politics here, and his lack of engagement with politics generally. So I often wondered how that influenced his translation of the diaries. But, you know, of course, you know, he translated them into English, and English wasn't his first language at all. You know, he still spoke a very awkward English. And about believing, I suppose, you know, the photographs are at the center. 1 or 2 or 3 photographs are at the center of each essay. The book is a group of essays that I didn't intend to tell a linear narrative, but somehow there is a linear narrative. That narrative is not the Holocaust story. It's another story. It begins in Zakopane. It ends in Zakopane at a very different time in the world. But the photographs, I examine them forensically. I research everything that is possible to research around them. And so I don't make things up, but I try and invent the truth, if you know what I mean. I try and, whereas my grandfather's words, they are evidence of a different sort somehow, particularly the years that he was writing in English. And you know, his diaries, you know, most of it would be incredibly boring if you weren't his granddaughter and trying to write this book. it's banal, it's mundane. It's about, it's often, I don't know if you know, Alon, Marianne, and others, people who make lists, often when you feel that your life doesn't add up to what it is that you expected of it, you make lists, and you cross things off. And my grandfather made copious lists. They were, what he filled each day with. And my sense was, to give himself, he was sort of recording purpose and meaning that he actually didn't feel deep down inside, internally. And I suppose, the diaries performed that function for him as well. I can't remember any of the other questions you asked. Yeah.
So we have many questions, and I encourage all of you to read the book and to write Terry and Marianne if you want. There is one final question that I want to ask both of you, Marianne and Terry. I'm not so sure we have an answer, but maybe it's worthwhile thinking about it. So here it goes. The photos you have had to retrieve so painstakingly have immense value, possibly due to their rarity, as well as because of the secrets and trauma they had locked in place. I wonder what your thoughts are on how difficult or easy it will be in another generation's time to decipher and extract secrets from the massive numbers of selfies, portraits, and random photos that are so easily taken today.
Marianne, you go first.
Maybe we have no answer, but...
Well, it depends on how and where they survive. I'm not so sure that all these digital archives are actually going to survive as well as the printed photos that Terry inherited or that I inherited, that you inherited, right? I mean, I think print is still, a more secure medium. So I don't know where all those selfies will go. But I would say that, the work Terry did to extract secrets or to contextualize these photos, use them as forensic evidence for so many different things, really depended on knowing the context and knowing and having the diaries and knowing the history and inserting them into that history. Without that, a man and a little girl on a lawn chair and a woman sitting in a chair would not mean very much. And there's so many orphaned photos that we find in flea markets and thrown out or that are passed down. My parents' slides are that they took on their many trips to Europe after they emigrated to the States are under our bed, boxes and boxes and boxes of them. I don't know what to do with them. So are there secrets in there? I don't know if I even, am able to look, and soon the technologies will evolve. So I think the difficulty has always been there. We just have a surfeit of images now. Terry, what do you think?
No, I agree with that completely. I mean, I think much less will survive because, even myself, I've lost hard drives with images. I every now and again give my kids the passwords to where I have my images stored. I know they'll probably go through them much later in their lives. They're not particularly interested now, just as I wasn't interested when my mother first started showing me these things. One always develops an interest when it's just a little bit too late. But yeah, I think we are now completely overwhelmed by images and also so many images that people take of themselves, performing themselves. I mean, it's very strange, the platforms onto which so many digital images are aimed, the platforms towards which so many digital images are aimed are so much about performance, not that studio photographs shot in Poland in 1925 weren't about performing, but it was a different kind of performance, and you had to hold still because it took so long to make an image and expose a negative.
But media history in itself shapes how we tell our stories, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
where we are in the history of media is part of how we conceive of ourselves and how we conceive of our stories.
Yeah.
So I think these shifts have now shifted how we see ourselves and what we want to pass down. I mean, I doubt that we really want to pass down the 8 photos I took this morning in Central Park when I was walking my dog. I mean, there was just, it was beautiful. The sun was shining, but do I really want to save these? But I'm also not going to throw them out. So they will be there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's no longer an event. The photo is no longer the same kind of event. But so we look at events differently.
Yes.
Can I quickly go back to a question that I remember you asked? Somebody asked about what made me get going with this project, and it's just to say, South Africa is a very complicated social, political, cultural environment. I've lived here most of my life, aside from 10 years that I've lived in the United States, and South Africa has been very hostile to immigrants and refugees who've come to live here from the rest of the African continent. And so for about 5 years, I worked really hard on a public art project, which encouraged, people who in neighborhoods where they came from all different parts of the continent to make movies, make images of themselves, tell stories. It was a big public art project that ended up being archived on a website and in a book. And at the end of it, as the book was being printed, oh, there it is. It's a project called Hotel Yeovil. And at the end of it, when I was writing the essay and sort of, I suppose, trying to understand and make sense of my impulse to make such a work, in the first place, I realized that there were these very powerful stories, in my own family. And my editor and who's now my friend and colleague, Bronwyn Lawful-Yun, encouraged me to begin working with the diaries and the photographs. And that was, and my mother then let me bring the material to South Africa. And I mean, that's what triggered my interest in working with my own family material. But the photographs had appeared many times over the years in drawings, etchings, prints, in other exhibitions, but it never made as much sense as when I worked with them here.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you for staying so late. Thank you, Marianne, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for
all your questions will be delivered to Terry because we keep them, and I encourage you to read the book. And thank you all very much. It has been an enlightening conversation. Thank you, Terry and Marianne, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish we could see the audience. It would be so nice.
All right.